Hi, this is Paul, and I wanted to make a video about Scott Adams because I want to bring Scott Adams into the longer C.S. Lewis miracles rationality conversation that we've been having. I actually started reading Scott Adams before I discovered Jordan Peterson, and I read not his Win Bigly book, which is his most recent one, but How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. And I started reading Scott Adams because of the Trump election, because after Trump was elected, I wanted to find out. I obviously I know people who voted for Trump, and some of those people are in my church. Some people in my church would never vote for Donald Trump. I very much I very much want to have a church that has both sides of the political aisle in it, because I don't want my church to be about politics. But I wanted to listen to someone who had a rationale for voting for Trump beyond just that they were a Republican, or so I found Scott Adams, and I read his book, and right away I found he was an interesting creature. And he was an interesting creature partly because of his epistemology, because what I found with Adams was someone who was a naturalist, and I thought someone who was trying to be a more thoroughgoing, consistent naturalist or materialist than let's say Sam Harris. And so in an upcoming video, I'm gonna note the Sam Harris Scott Adams podcast that Sam Harris made, which I thought was a very interesting conversation. And at some point, I want to bring Jordan Peterson into this, and also, as I said, we'll talk some C.S. Lewis in this. But for some of you, probably don't know Sam or Scott Adams that well, and so a little bit of introduction. And so I found some video clips where I think he quite nicely summarizes his position. This one from Stefan Molyneux, I thought was one of the clearest. Articulations.
So where I feel that you're harshing on
what he
gig,
believes,
so to speak, is when you start talking about the human brain. Use the quote: "The human brain is not capable of comprehending truth at a deep level." Now, I need to bring this up. Obviously, people are going to read this and say, "Steph, why didn't you bring this up?"
Now, of course, some of you out there know who Stefan Molyneux is. He's a controversial figure. He's a Canadian. He promotes himself as an Aristotelian, as a rationalist, and so he's big as. And again, I haven't watched much Molyneux, so I don't really know how to categorize him. And categorizing him is a little dicey, as I know from a previous video that I've done. But he's really big into reason. And so this is what kind of makes Scott Adams an interesting person to talk to with respect to that, because Adams has a different take.
And it's a fair point, because of course that's my, philosophy thing is trying to aim at that as significantly as possible, but make the case for this approach to understanding the human mind and how it operates relative to reality.
Well, so I start with what I'd call the hypnotist view of the world. So the normal view of the world is that we're rational creatures 90% of the time. And we all recognize that, 10% of the time we get a little crazy, but it's mostly other people. It doesn't happen to me so much. The hypnotist reverses that completely and says we are an irrational species who rationalizes after the fact. And by the way, science largely backs that up. There are a number of studies showing that reason and logic and facts don't really change people's minds the way we assume they should. But people are really great at rationalizing why they did the irrational thing that they did. So once you understand that's the normal way the world works, and by the way, you can't even be a hypnotist unless you understand that, because nothing else would make sense. Then you ask yourself, well, how could we be in this situation? How could we have built these great civilizations and gotten to this point where we're the ruling species if we're not rational? Well, here's the thing. Evolution didn't care if you understood. It only cared if you made more of yourself. The bar for evolution is really low. Did you make more of yourself? Success. Did you not? You failed. And we were able to make more of ourselves, even though you and I could have a complete disagreement on, let's say, this point, right? Or you could have a different religion, which is like living in a different reality. You could think that the president of the United States is a monster ready to destroy the world. I could think he's a populist who's got some policies you don't like, but he's basically harmless. So we're living in completely different interpretations of reality. And I would argue that that's the normal case, not the exception. And once you understand it as normal, it changes how you see everything and do everything. And I go further and say that you can predict the future better by assuming that people are irrational than you can if you believe they're rational. And I set that as my test. And it was the reason that I predicted so publicly and consistently, at least until Pussygate anyway, that President Trump or candidate Trump would become president, because I believe that this notion of people as irrational and easily persuaded would be more predictive than any set of facts and fact-checking you could put together.
So let's talk about the...
So, So there's a lot in there, and I actually agree with Scott Adams on that point, that people are not very rational. They're certainly not 90% rational. And as Adams says, he goes on with Molyneux, and Molyneux will make the point that when he was in high school, he was debating, and someone would make a joke, and everyone liked the person who made the joke, and so we're biased to agree with that person's point. And Molyneux was annoyed and upset by that because he had reason on his side, and you see this perpetually on YouTube with all the rationality channels. Here we have the reason. This is how we are. So this is how everyone's going to believe. Now what's really important to understand when it comes to reason is that it is reason attempts to transcend subjectivity and individuality. It's an attempt to be able to create communities around a common, in a sense, objective criteria. And this is where I get into my monarchical vision. Reason imagines that we can transcend our individuality, our subjectivity, and we can see the world clear-eyed. And if in fact we can do this, if I have this capacity and you have this capacity, then you and I can be on the same page because we will see the world clearly. Math works the same for everyone, even though people have a hard time with math. So on and so forth. This is the project of rationality. This is the dream of rationality, and we might even say that behind it is the motivation of rationality. Well, what might that motivation be? Well, if we look at the story of the Tower of Babel, I think in some ways the story of the Tower of Babel could be understood as a story about rationality, because the descendants of Noah congregate on the plain, and in a sense, rationality is this tower that we build up into the sky in order to be able to see down on the world. And now we can ask a question about motivation, in order to control the world, because he who can predict has a tremendous power to anticipate and therefore control. Same thing goes with argumentation and reason. The idea behind reason and argumentation is that if I can lay things out in a rational way for you, I can convince you. And this then gets into Scott Adams' big point that he keeps making over and over again, is the power of persuasion, that emotion and motivation are far more potent persuaders of people than reason is. Reason is itself actually fairly weak when it comes to motivating people, and political campaigns know this. This is part of the reason negative advertising. Nobody wants to be seen as doing negative advertising, but everyone does it because people are quite often persuaded and motivated by fear more than altruism. Fear is a terribly strong motivator. And again, you get into Jordan Peterson stuff when he does his future authoring program. He tries to harness both the desire for a preferred outcome by writing your preferred future, but also writing your hellish future if you don't achieve your goals. And so in that way, Peterson tries to marshal both our attractive nature and also our repulsive nature. We motivate by desire and fear. And so Adams here, his, I find his anthropology in this sense, not too far in disagreement with my own. In Romans 1, for example, the Apostle Paul says, we suppress the truth by our desires. We have a hard time finding the truth. We have a hard time seeing the truth. We have a hard time maintaining the truth. And what I want you to hear behind Scott Adams, I think both in this video, I think I've decided to turn this into 2 videos because there's a lot of material, especially when we get into Sam Harris talking to Scott Adams, because they have a pretty strong political disagreement between the two of them, even though both of them begin from the same premise, which is that we are an evolved creature who has, in terms of Darwin, evolved towards this certain outcome. Peterson shares this. They're all, in that sense, Darwinian in their narrative. Now, Peterson will take on Harris, and that's going to be a very interesting conversation this summer between the two of them. But so Scott Adams comes in here, and in some ways, Scott Adams acts like he's the greatest skeptic of them all, because he is the one that most emphasizes our susceptibility to all of the corruptions of reason that we find so common. Now, what's really interesting, and this comes through in a recent video, Adams does a Twitter Periscope daily or almost daily, and then some YouTube channels pick this up. So if you want to go through and see some old ones, but he has this theory of 2 movies, and here he's jumping into the conversation between John Legend and Kanye West with respect to, should Kanye warm up to Trump, or should Kanye side with the other tribe that says Trump is a monster, Trump is a devil, Trump is a racist. We should all, with one voice, denounce Trump, and if you're not denouncing Trump with us, then you're part of the enemy. This is the basic tribalism that is at work within our political process. And I, in a tweet recently, I said, Trump is, in a sense, he's like a glue trap, because I find people on the right and the left, it's almost Trumpological possession, because I find people can't not talk about Trump. And so with all my friends on the left, I often encourage them to, you don't have anything you're going to be able to do until the next election. So see if you can stop reacting, because he wants all this attention, and he takes all the oxygen out of the room. Don't give him so much attention. But the left just can't leave him alone. And then this sets up this tribal dynamic of, the left feels themselves the victims because of Trump. The right feels themselves the victims because of the left. And then each of them indulges their victim status and uses that as the justification for whatever it is that they wish to. You did what was reprehensible first, and so that then justifies the reprehensible things that I'll do. Well, this is the way that we tear down our institutions, because we say, well, you broke the rules, so now I can break the rules too. And this is behavior from our childhood. This is behavior from the playground. And we'll see this food fight happening right now in the public space, because you hear it with respect to I didn't watch the White House Correspondents' Dinner, but apparently there was a comedian there who was pretty rough on Trump. And so then this was actually on the Sunday morning talk shows. And then the right says, see how you are? And the left says, but Trump started it. And it's like, well, isn't this what you see when you take care of children? Can't we get above that? Well, Scott Adams would say, well, this is exactly consistent with what we would expect from human beings. All right. So he's working on Kanye and John Legend. Kanye tweeted some things at Trump, and Trump responded positively. And John Legend says, hey, so stay away from here. And this is how Scott Adams looks at the situation.
Explain it. Now, the normal world, as you know, is quite common. In fact, it's universal. It's not just common; it's the universal way the human people look at things. Human people.
Now Adams has, you can see on his screen, he's got this two movie theories, and this basically says that we see things out there and we interpret it in two separate narratives. Now within that, you might notice, well, okay, so we see a common set of facts. Yeah, there's obviously always some selection in the facts, but for the sake of clarity, for his demonstration of his new movie theory, this is what he'll talk about.
Human beings. We have lots of confirmation bias and lots of cognitive dissonance, and we imagine that we're rational creatures, but we're not. Now, if you said to both these people, hey, Kanye, hey, John Legend, have you heard of these concepts, cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias? I'll bet both of them would say yes, and that they would know essentially what those mean and that they're common things. I think Kanye might be a step ahead in the sense that even if you know what these things are, there's a second trap. And the trap is that you believe that these are the things that happen to other people.
And that's exactly right. It's a second trap. And the difficulty is, do we ever escape the second trap? In other words, if you can be the seer, if you can be Paul Vanderklay or Scott Adams or Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris, and you can stop and, in a sense, transcend the conversation by saying, well, let's pull out of the scrum right now and get above it and recognize what we're doing. Well, we've got some confirmation bias going here. We've got some cognitive dissonance. That I think Scott Adams is exactly right. What happened when Trump was elected, that through the American left was just whoosh. And my favorite treatment of that was Saturday Night Live's Little Brooklyn campaign party with, I forget the comedian's name who was in it. And you had all these white folks watching, and then why can't I think of his name? And then the comedian who's African American, Chris Rock was in there, and why can't I think of the other guy's name? It'll show up in the comments section, trust me. It's like, oh, well, there's racism in America. I thought that sketch just nailed it perfectly. But Adams is right. Just because you see this, there's a second trap which says that, well, this is what other people do. Now, the funny thing is that, of course, even if you see this trap, it doesn't mean you are immune to it, because actually, if you take a look at a little bit later in the Molyneux interview, Scott Adams has to explain to Molyneux why he switched sides so often during the election.
Process of Trump to Hillary to Johnson to Trump to, I don't know, Marvin the Martian, I think, was thrown in the mix at some point. So what was the process? And I was really, really struck by how dangerous it became for you. I wasn't quite aware of where you were in the Nazi pantheon for people.
Yeah. So I started out writing about just the topic of persuasion, but that was very heavily biased toward Trump because he had the good game. So I was writing more about what he was doing right. That made people say, you're a Trump supporter. And where I live in Northern California, that's physically dangerous. So I did lose, the majority of my friends. My Facebook feed is very, very lonely right now. And there were people not far from where I live who were literally being beaten, leaving Trump rallies just for being on that side. And so there were times I would not be able to speak if I thought I was overheard, et cetera. So it got so dangerous that people online and social media were calling me Joseph Goebbels, or Goebbels, however you pronounce it, Hitler's main PR person. And if you're being called Hitler or Hitler's henchman, and people are believing it not in a exaggerated way, but they believe this candidate that you seem to be supporting is actually going to bring Hitler-like policies to the world, you do have moral authority to physically kill that person. Yeah, so once people thought they had moral authority to kill Hitler or his henchmen, and I think that people were actually starting to think it was okay to punch a Nazi, for example. You would see that on social media. I publicly said I endorsed Clinton for my safety. And even though that's not a real reason, and even though people recognized it wasn't a political statement, it was just the sort of thing that people say in public for whatever purpose, it was good enough. People said, all right, we'll go bother other people. And so the pressure almost immediately came off me. And it wasn't until the Pussygate thing that, or actually it wasn't until Clinton said that she wanted to, increase the death tax to what would have been effectively a 75% tax on every new dollar I earned, because most of that would have been taxed at 50% and then another 50% when I died. And that was just, it felt like confiscation. That was one topic I could understand. There was no complexity to it. I was earning money just to give it away. And that I couldn't live with that. So for a few weeks, I endorsed candidate Trump for that reason alone. And I also hated the bullying. The amount of bullying I was getting online because the Trump haters was just through the roof. It was just insane. And I have sort of a trigger for bullies. I always have. It's just the one thing that sets me off like nothing else. And I tend to get aggressive in those situations.
Now pay attention here to his motivations. His motivations are, as we would expect from a materialist, completely constructed. He was, first interested in Trump because of the persuasion element, and he was talking about him, but then he's getting group pressure, peer pressure from other people in Northern California, where I live too. I think he's probably closer to the coast, probably in the Bay Area, or maybe I don't know where he lives, but he's getting pressure. He's probably had always been identified more with the left in some ways, even though he was he was a pretty determined capitalist. But so that pressure then changed his mind. He came out and said, well, I'll support Hillary, but then there's taxes, and Hillary and her plan would take away his money, and then he's well, now he's got a problem with that. So okay, so what is truth? Well, does truth have any bearing on preference? Is an election a contest of who do you think would be a better president for the country? Or who do you think would be a better president for me? Well, maybe I am going to bring in Peterson here. We'll see how this goes. So, right away you have this question of truth and this question of reality. And then you would have the question, well, who would be a better president for me in the long run? How do I know what will happen if Hillary gets elected? Or how do I know what will happen if Donald Trump gets elected? And I think we can pretty easily say we don't know. But so, he continues on this.
Instead of defensive. So I just said, well, screw it. I don't want to have my money stolen on my deathbed, and I don't like these bullies. I'll support the president.
All of these reasons. And are they rational? Are they emotional? Well, how can you separate that?
Or the candidate Trump for president. And it wasn't until Pussygate that I said, okay, I'm going to temporarily back Johnson, because as far as I know, he only touches himself, and that seemed like a far safer endorsement.
So here we have the ethical motivation. And well, how do ethics come into this? Well, now things are getting really complicated, and the project for, well, we'll get to Scott Adams' project a little bit and his filter idea, but right away, what was supposed to be such a clear thing about truth and bias and how people are, well, Scott Adams, who's been telling us about this, and I agree with a lot of what he's saying here in terms of people are full of biases. People are full of all of these things. Well, how can we know truth? Well, this gets difficult. So then comes out for Hillary to get pressure off, and then she's going to take his money, so he comes out for Trump. But then there's Pussygate, so then he goes for Johnson.
But that didn't last. Once the Pussygate story, came down in priority a little bit, and people.
So again, it's peer pressure, because when he's reading The Tribe, and when this video comes out, and Trump is talking about when you're high status, you can grab women, and they'll let you get away with it. They'll let you do whatever because you're high status. This is reprehensible. This is morally reprehensible, Scott Adams says. And so I'm off Trump. And then he looks around, he gathers the signals from everyone and says, well, maybe it isn't so morally reprehensible. And so, okay. Now again, I think in some ways, Adams is more consistent even in this than I hear sometimes from, let's say, Stefan Molyneux or Sam Harris, that this is because when it comes to ethics, often again, we like to imagine we are transcending these motivations. And in fact, even in public, this flip-flopping that Scott Adams did, we count as a strike against him morally. And in fact, we respect if he takes a moral stand at the cost of his friends. Now, this is a really interesting dynamic, because so often, on one hand, we gauge morality by what everyone else thinks is moral, and this is a powerful thing that happens. On the other hand, we gauge morality when everyone else is against them, because then we say, aha, I don't see a natural, implicitly corrupt motivation for this decision. He must be making this because of reason, because of some higher good, because of some higher value, because of some higher knowledge. And again, pay attention to the language. This is reason as sort of a Tower of Babel. So this goes on, and but now jump a little bit ahead to Scott Adams talking about a podcast, a Sam Harris podcast, and now Trump has won. Scott Adams lost a lot of friends, but he's getting a lot of other attention. I'm sure he lost a lot of speaking gigs financially. I don't know how this settled out for him, but again, it's interesting the way we evaluate this. If he lost a lot of money because his support for Trump, we score this in the positive moral category often, because we say, aha, he's standing up for his beliefs at great cost. Because we simply assume that if you are making money with an idea, well, that's a moral corruption. Now, again, my focus here is on this natural debate between nature and reason. And we have these implicit biases with respect to them, that if there's money involved or other motivations involved, that undermines reason. Well, what are we saying about reason when we say that? Now let's hear a little bit of Scott Adams' filter ideas.
Anyway, so my point in all of this, of course, I'll reiterate, is that humans are not really good at understanding base reality. We all have our own little filters, and those filters, we don't know if they're right or wrong, we never will, but some filters are better at predicting, and some are better at making you happy. If you think that Trump is a monster, that doesn't make you happy. And if you think he's incompetent, well, that doesn't predict what has happened so far, because he got the nomination, got the election, and so far at the end of 2017, he's got a strong economy, he's got jobs, he's ended trade deals, he's got judges, he's beaten ISIS in the field, he's got rid of regulations.
Now, what's important here is that he again outlines in a different format, but it's pretty consistent with what he's been saying. And this, if you go into almost any Scott Adams video, he will give a little shorthand into his, he'll lay out his framework here. But pay attention, we're bad at looking at base reality, but within his system, he also assumes we have the capacity to do this outcome evaluation and say that, well, beforehand, Scott Adams was able to pick Trump. Well, yeah, you did. You flip-flopped a little bit, but that's okay. I'll forgive you that. You're human. We're all like this. That doesn't undermine your anthropology, okay? And so what we do is we have these two filters. We have this happiness filter and we have this outcome filter. And so these are two valid filters by which we can make judgments. Now it's important to recognize here that in some ways the happiness filter and the outcome filter are slightly different. Because the happiness filter is in a sense a moral argument. And it says that happiness is a moral good, and so a good in and of itself. And so if I pick a filter that makes me happy, well, that's justifiable because happiness is a good in and of itself. And then his second filter, which is an outcome filter, where we can successfully predict. So the happiness filter is kind of a good in and of itself filter. We are made for happiness, and the outcome filter, the predictive filter, is a filter that helps us retune our truth. Now there might be some fairly binary filters that we pay attention to. For example, if because of Trump's actions, or to whatever extent Trump participated in a hopeful resolution of the conflict in Korea and the fear of a nuclear exchange, if in the short term North and South Korea reconcile, North Korea gets rid of its nuclear missiles, China doesn't get upset at the possibility of reconciliation between North and South Korea, Trump gets credit for that. Maybe Trump wins a Nobel Prize for that. Well, to the degree that Trump participated in that, therefore he's a genius. But again, it's important to pay attention to what we're doing here, because in a sense what we're doing is we're saying, well, we can't know truth. So there's a happiness filter that we can use to say, hey, if it makes me happy, that's justifiable. And then there's a predictive filter. But now let's pay a little more attention to that predictive filter. What it in a sense says is that via this predictive filter, we can find out a little bit of truth. And if we find out that little bit of truth, then we can, now pay attention here, we can take this truth, abstract it to a degree. Let's say we abstract it by saying Trump is a smart man, Trump is a genius and not a fool, because that's kind of been the debate all along. Is Trump a manipulative genius, or is Trump an idiot? And you will find the left, you will find his critics playing both tunes, and sometimes the right will come up and say, hey, wait a minute, is he a fool or is he a genius? Is he evil or is he an idiot? You can't have both. So in a sense, Scott Adams wants to say, well, if we find Trump has done a bunch of good things, and then he basically says in earlier videos, if at the start of 2018, most people are going to say, wow, everything is going great. Yeah, but pay attention. We're having to put that we're making this judgment within time. And these outcomes are by no means quite as discrete and obvious. For example, in the middle of the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln was not esteemed to any degree like Ulysses S. Grant was. If you look now back at both of them, of course, Abraham Lincoln, at least in many parts of the United States and other parts of the world, is considered this great genius and this great hero, and Ulysses S. Grant is a bit of a sad story. Struggles with alcohol, good in marriage, a lot of corruption in his administration. And so now if you say Grant and Lincoln as presidents, well, they look very different. All of our views are within the stream, and so, which leads us again exactly into the motivation for this privileged vision of reason, a monarchical vision that is outside of time. It is outside of subjectivity, where we can make claims, where we can pass judgment that in fact will be eternal. And as I've mentioned before with my other videos where I talk about this monarchical vision, we're in a sense talking about a godlike thing. And this is where things get weird too, because this monarchical vision is in itself impersonal by design, non-subjective. The subjectivity has been taken out of it. But we are persons. And so when we attempt to strive for this monarchical vision, when we attempt to strive for objectivity, we do so as personal beings who have will and desire and motivation, and therefore we wish to take the fruit of this monarchical vision, and in Scott Adams, which would be this little bit of truth that we could pull out of the equation by virtue of having correctly predicted something, and therefore we can employ it and what? And, well, depends what the human heart wants to do. And this gets back into, we can employ it in terms of my vision of the world coming to pass. Having the power, having the influence, having the power of persuasion to persuade the world according to how I see it. Well, so now we get back again to the basic question. Is there really one world, or is a world how I see it? And can we know? And so in a sense, C.S. Lewis makes this point about seeing through. You see through things in order to see something. If you just keep seeing through, all that you're left, ironically, with is the subjective. Now, again, Scott Adams says most people just add post hoc rationalization. Does this really, have we really escaped that with this argument? Because, well, evaluate Trump's presidency here at the end of April, beginning of May 2018. His favorable ratings are in the 40s. Who knows? So you might say, well, you can't evaluate it until the end of his term. And you wonder, well, when will the end of his term be? Will he make it all 4 years? Will the midterm swing? I mean, we don't know these things. We can't answer these things. And Scott Adams says, well, I predicted it. Well, okay, good for you. And I forget, the one website, a lot of other websites predicted. The game of prediction is interesting. Now, if we bring Jordan Peterson into this, which I'll do in my next video when I get into some of the Q&A things about, well, how can we get past our perceptions? And it'll be interesting because Peterson will bring subjectivity back in, because just as Scott Adams did naturally at the Pussygate thing, Scott Adams pulls back because he's got this ethical filter, and he says, well, maybe Trump is unethical. Oh, okay. And this, of course, will be the big debate between he and Sam Harris. Is Trump unethical? And round they'll go. Both of these, now we get back into C.S. Lewis, naturalism and knowledge. And Lewis in his book Miracles says there are really two perspectives here. One says that, the naturalist says that everything is the whole show. The naturalist says that, along with Scott Adams, that we're 90% irrational and 10% rational, but even the rational is a function of the natural. And it's right at that moment that people have a hard time understanding Lewis, because that's exactly where Lewis begins to poke and says, where does that finally leave us? And if that is so, can there be a monarchical vision? Because Lewis will actually say that the degree to which we use reason is a degree to which we touch, to which we experience, to which we inhabit, to which we practice the supernatural. And now, to put on a Jordan Peterson pragmatic hat, that's how we all act. We act like reason is privileged. Stefan Molyneux does it. Sam Harris does it. Rationality Rules Dude does it. Scott Adams does it. Jordan Peterson does it. Paul Vanderklay does it. In fact, if you run this idea down, there's just a piece of Jonah Goldberg's newest book. He's got a segment of it in the National Review. You know, he's arguing in a sense that since Descartes and Locke, since the Enlightenment, we have ramped up our capacity for rationality. We have ramped up our capacity to have this monarchical vision. We have, in a sense, built the Tower of Babel, and it has worked. Now, Jordan Peterson comes along and says, but worked for how long? You see, because at the beginning, what you do when you deal with rationality in this way is you take out the subjective, and by taking out the subjective, you want it to be trans-subjective, in other words, to be true of every human being. You also take out the temporal. You take out time. And you say, this therefore is eternal. Well, again, now we're kind of knocking on Greek notions of divinity. Now, Hebrew, Athens and Jerusalem, Hebrew ideas of God, Greek ideas of God. In many ways, Christianity has some of both, as does Judaism, as does Islam. There's a lot going on there, and again, you can listen to Philip Carey's audiobook, Great Courses series on philosophy and religion, and I think he walks through that quite nicely as he goes through the early stages of the development of Christian theology. But pay attention to what we're doing. So then C.S. Lewis comes in here basically and says, this is the game we're all playing, and we should be honest about this game, because naturalists all, and Lewis says, and this is why I pick this argument to engage the naturalists, because they cannot give up reason. They default to it. Scott Adams himself, who is fully aware of the second trap, falls into it, just like we all do. And so Scott Adams, on one hand, wants to say, this is how we are. And this is part of the reason I appreciate Scott Adams, because he's being a very thoroughgoing naturalist. But a lot of the other naturalists are getting very annoyed by him, because Scott Adams is just further on that spectrum down towards full-blown skepticism. But it's really hard to live there, because Scott Adams believes he has something to contribute, and so he does YouTube videos, and as do I. And so, actually, Scott Adams does Periscopes, but there's, Lewis says, but we all recognize corruption by motivation. We all recognize corruption by physical or physiological intervention. If I get drunk, I don't reason so well. If I'm tired, I don't reason so well. If I'm angry, I don't reason so well. And then we talk about, these reptilian part of our brains and these more developed part of our brains. If, corruption by individual limitations, maybe one is smarter than the other. Maybe one just, their brain works so that their emotions aren't integrated. And we'll get into that when we look at some of Peterson's videos in the question and answer. Corruption by peer pressure. We saw that with Scott Adams, and he keeps flipping sides on who he's endorsing. And, well, now you might say, well, he kept flipping sides, but he always felt Trump would win. But that's not exactly true, because with Pussygate, he thought, oh, this is gonna sink Trump, so I'm gonna pull back away from him. Well, what motivation's going on in your mind there? Well, it's a very common motivation that you want to be on the winning side. Well, why do you want to be on the winning side? And I forgot to unplug the phone. I forgot to unplug the phone because often I forget to plug back in the phone. But this is what we're doing. And so Lewis says, this is the game that we play. And all of the naturalists he knows play this game too. And so again, reason is used to transcend corruption and filters. Lewis sees this as a witness to the supernatural. It attempts to see truth by establishing an objective, subjectively eliminating with time and individuality perspective. the monarchical vision, in a sense, the reason as the Tower of Babel. And the goal of this is, in many ways, human agreement. Because, as Jonathan Haidt continues to stress, multiple brains are better than one brain. Well, how can multiple brains think together? Well, again, now we're seeing how useful reason is, because multiple brains might be feeling differently. Well, this again gets into the question of persuasion, because, well, actually, you can make it's easier to make a whole group of people feel the same way than it is easy to make a whole group of people think the same way. But what you recognize is making everyone feel the same way has some utility, but what's it serving? It's usually serving either reason or emotion in whatever leader is doing the persuading. And then we get back into the question of, well, what are the goals of that leader? Well, it's a very rationalist question, and then you can see the constant tension between these two parts of ourself. And, when we get back into the Peterson stuff, we're going to have to talk about the two hemispheres of the brain. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about his conversation with McGilchrist, and McGill something, talked about the hemispheres of the brain. But basically, in that video, they get into some process theology. And I think we're going to have to talk about process and human beings at some point. But, this is where I think Scott Adams is helpful and comes into the conversation, and because now we're adding different elements. So we have Jordan Peterson, Scott Adams, Sam Harris. These are all, Darwinian in the sense that we're coming from below in terms of human evolution. But Adams is kind of the skeptical, and he's also the outlier, because you'll hear if you listen to, and I'd recommend listening to, it's a very interesting podcast, a little long, but the podcast with Sam Harris and Scott Adams, and the podcast devolves. Now, I haven't heard a lot of Sam Harris, but the podcast kind of devolves into Trump possession, where Trump just takes over the podcast. Like, Trump seems to take over the news cycle. He takes over the minds of especially the left right now. Trump just takes over everything. It's all Trump all the time, which is why sometimes I say he shall not be named, because even just naming him, gets into the conversation. I suppose if I want to put Trump in the title of this, I'll get a lot of views, but whatever. So I'm going to do another video, because I want to take Scott Adams, now that I've done this introduction about who he is and how he thinks and how he's kind of on the skeptical end of the materialist naturalist, and someone who I think is trying to embody that, which I think makes him one of the best illustrations of why that can't be embodied. Because I think finally, if you become a thoroughgoing naturalist, you actually have to become impersonal. I think you have to figure out how to embody the loss of your personhood. And so eventually, as we go through Lewis's book, we're going to begin to see the connection between naturalism and pantheism. Because what's the problem in this mix is the personal. And so then when Lewis begins to sketch out the relationship between humanity and nature, you're going to have a relationship between the personal and the impersonal, because the personal always governs the impersonal. And that's why Lewis says, nature and reason, nature and humanity are always at war, because we colonize nature, but nature has ways of subverting us and killing us and undermining us, and so on and so forth. So there's a little introduction to Scott Adams. I'll be talking about Scott Adams more, and using some of Scott Adams' stuff in conjunction with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, because I think, again, this is where Peterson gets very interesting, because Peterson owns some of these things, I think, better than Adams or Harris. And again, showing my biases, I think actually C.S. Lewis anticipated most of this. Now Lewis isn't a pragmatist like Peterson is, but Lewis walked through so many of these arguments in the 40s and 50s and has them in his books. And these are actually the reasons that Lewis became a Christian. So